The day Henry got the notice that his wife was critically ill, he was surrounded by her sisters. They were pushing him to agree to his wife having a wedding with another man. Brother-in-law, all Irene wants is to have a wedding with Richard. She's on her deathbed. Can't you just fulfill her wish? Don't be so selfish. Yeah, brother-in-law, Irene only has about 2 months left. Remember how she saved you, breaking her ribs, losing a kidney? Without her, the Wiltons would have gone bankrupt. You love Irene so deeply, yet you're not willing to grant her last wish? It's just a wedding. She's not divorcing you or fighting you for anything. We can't stand it if you don't agree. It's so unfair to Irene. They all took turns talking, making Henry seem like a villain for not allowing his wife to marry another man. Irene, what do you think? Henry's fingers twitched nervously, throat tightened, looking at Irene with hope. I abandoned Richard to marry you. Even if you agree to us having a wedding now, he wouldn't agree, Irene replied, sitting with her legs crossed, her beautiful features clouded with disappointment and regret. Henry lowered his gaze, feeling a pang of bitterness as his last hope faded. This was all orchestrated by Irene. Why would she help him out now? Irene wanted to leave with her true love, but didn't want to be seen as heartless. So she came up with this fake illness scheme. If he hadn't accidentally found out the truth from her chat with her sisters, he'd have been none the wiser, even to his grave. He thought she was genuinely terminally ill, tirelessly researching online, interviewing experts, and seeking miracle cures regardless of the cost. He even visited temples and prayed for her safety nationwide. In the end, it was all her charade. How absurd. Since she was so set on marrying Richard, he would let her. From the moment he uncovered the truth, he decided he wouldn't love her anymore. Moreover, he would take her inheritance and marry her archenemy. Fine, I agree. Henry forced a smile, though his face turned pale. Hearing this, everyone was overjoyed, especially Irene. Her eyes gleamed with a light he hadn't seen for a long time. But I have a condition. Henry spoke again. Irene glanced over, slightly frowning. What is it? I want the shares of the WH Group in your hands. Deal. On behalf of Irene, we agree. For her happiness, we sisters will get whatever you want. Just get Richard to marry Irene willingly. Henry looked at Irene. Only her word mattered. Irene, say yes now, her sisters urged. Okay. After a brief thought, Irene nodded. I'll convince him to spend the last days with you, Henry resolved. Irene had promised Richard to help him complete a bucket list, but marrying Henry had broken Richard's heart, leaving many things undone for him. Now, those tasks passed to Henry. First, deliver 10 limited edition Patek Philippe watches to Richard. Second, paint 100 portraits of Richard. Third, kneel on 3,000 steps at a temple and pray for Richard's safety. Lastly, apologize to Richard. Richard was the son of the Wiltons' male housekeeper, filled with ambition from a young age. After failing to seduce Henry's sister, he wooed Henry's fiancée, Irene. Henry's father eventually kicked Richard out of the Wiltons. Now, Richard demanded Henry publicly kneel and apologize on the Wiltons' behalf. Without hesitation, Henry dropped to the ground with a thud. Looking up at him, Richard, I'm sorry. Everything in the past was the Wiltons' fault. Please forgive me and spend these last days with Irene. Is that it? So insincere, Richard said, spreading his hands. Your love for Irene is nothing. What do you want? Henry asked. Have you forgotten how I was kicked out of the Wiltons? Richard leaned in menacingly, hiding malevolence and bitterness behind his handsome facade. Henry trembled slightly, frowning back at him. His gaze inadvertently caught Irene behind Richard. Her eyes were burning, love evident. Henry lowered his head again, feeling a fresh pang of pain. Just endure a little more. It'll be over soon. Henry raised his head once more, slapping himself hard and shouting, I'm sorry. I'm despicable. I'm a piece of shit. The crowd gasped. Someone recorded on their phone the flash blinding Henry. He bit his lip, holding back tears. Henry, if you hadn't coerced Irene into marrying, we'd have been together long ago. You ruined Irene. Made her so troubled she got cancer. Why not you? Richard twisted the truth with righteous indignation. Tears flowed, making his handsome face seem tragic. I'm begging you, stay with her through the end. Henry gritted out. I'll do it because you're begging me, Richard said. The crowd, whipped into a frenzy, began to curse Henry. What a scumbag, deserves to die. Slapping yourself, what's the use? Bow and apologize. Hate people who bully others like this. Should just end it all, someone said, throwing a water bottle hard at Henry's forehead. He fell over, followed by more bottles and stones hitting him, leaving him battered and bloody. Henry's heart ached fiercely. Tears mixed with blood entered his mouth, tasting bitter and metallic. He and Irene grew up together. She once risked her life for him, making him believe it was love. From then on, he followed her, his heart and mind filled with her. To marry Irene, he turned down an alliance with the Browns, making his father so angry he ended up in the hospital. He offered his WH Group shares to her as a stepping stone to fight for the Booths' inheritance. Irene never said she didn't want to marry him. He always thought Richard was the one pursuing Irene and never knew how much they loved each other. The signs were always there. Irene's coldness, the way she brushed him off, her regular trips abroad where she wouldn't let him into her study. He was just too dumb to see it. Who knows how long it was before they stopped, until he was numb with pain. Henry tried to get up, saw Richard holding Irene, and watched as Richard raised an eyebrow at him triumphantly. Idiot! Richard mocked. A smile appeared on Irene's pale face. Richard was right. Irene, let's go, I'm hungry. Sure. Richard wrapped his arm around Irene and they left. She didn't glance at Henry once. Henry watched her silhouette get further away, feeling like the hurt wasn't so bad anymore. Now he just had to wait for her to die in a month, take what was his, and fulfill his father's wish to ally with the Browns. He staggered to his feet, but everything went black and he collapsed to the ground. Henry woke up in the hospital. A nurse struggled to find a vein, trying 7 or 8 times before succeeding. A few people at the door peeked in, pointing at him. That's him, the wicked man who bullies people with his wealth. He's the one who drove Irene's grandmother to her death, forcing Irene to marry him. What a shameless guy. If he dies, he deserves it, no need to save him. Henry heard them, looked at his swollen hand from the floor, guessed what happened, and let out a bitter smile. He checked his phone and saw the push notifications. Richard had posted online, condemning Henry and exposing his wrongdoings, pinning him to the post of infamy as a vile young master and a mistress. Henry tried to have the post deleted, but nobody dared. Someone hinted that Irene had ordered no one to remove it. Henry read the comments filled with curses and accusations, feeling cold inside, and turned off his phone. Just then, Richard called, demanding Henry bring him clothes at the mountaintop observatory. Henry instinctively wanted to refuse but heard Richard mockingly remind him, Henry, don't forget you need me to take care of dying Irene. You have to make me happy. Grinding his teeth, Henry forced himself out of bed. I got it. Following Richard's request, he went to the mall to buy the latest A-brand jacket and took a cab to the observatory. The mountaintop observatory had been built for Richard's 20th birthday, not open to the public. Henry had wanted to see it before, but Irene always came up with excuses. He eventually gave up. Now standing at the observatory entrance, he felt nothing. He stepped in calmly and saw Richard and Irene nestled together under the artificial starlight. It's great I can still be with you, Irene. Don't we need to delete those online posts? I was just mad he took you for so many years, venting a bit, not meaning to hurt him. Whatever makes you happy. Irene smiled gently, he'll endure anything for me. He's so good to you. Do you really not love him? Richard asked, feigning seriousness with wide eyes. I love you. Richard pulled her into a kiss, fire igniting between them, heating the air around them. Irene let out a soft moan, scratching Richard's back, making him shiver and seating her on his lap. Richard adjusted her on his knee, a provocative gaze directed at Henry standing in the shadows. He's doing it on purpose, making Henry watch him and Irene together. Pale, Henry met his gaze, nails digging into his palms. Despite deciding not to love, the sight was unbearable. A dull knife cutting into his heart, sending waves of pain throughout his body. Irene undid Richard's shirt, her lips pressing onto his collarbone. A satisfied sigh escaping, Richard shuddering. Irene, it hurts. Are you this eager with Henry too? Richard, don't mention him, it kills the mood. Enjoy the pleasure I give you, no idle talk allowed. The handbag hit the floor, and Henry fled, nearly twisting his ankle as he fell, knee scratching on the rocks. Ignoring the pain, he scrambled up, ran till Richard's gasps and Irene's heightened cries were no longer audible. He didn't stop running until he reached the road at the mountain's base, falling who knows how many times, his dress pants stained with crimson by the time he returned home. Instead of tending to his wounds, he packed away everything related to Irene from the living room. No use keeping things from someone who's dying. Henry spent all night packing, filling for big boxes. At dawn, he had the servants carry them to the backyard. He tossed the first watch he'd designed for Irene into the incinerator, the flames rising with it. Piece by piece, he threw everything related to Irene into the fire, the last wedding photo vanishing with the smoke. In the swirling smoke, he thought he saw the girl who saved him at 15 vanish too. The dark smoke stung Henry's eyes till he couldn't keep them open. He choked, coughing until tears ran down his face. He felt more relaxed than ever, like a weight had been lifted off his chest. Everything he once treasured, he ended up burning so easily. Turns out, letting go of someone who doesn't love you is easy. Henry turned back into his room. He took a hot bath, changed into pajamas and fell into a deep sleep. He woke up in the evening and instinctively grabbed his phone. He opened the chat with Irene, fearing he missed a message from her while he slept. Then he smirked at himself, realizing some bad habits take time to change. Irene never reached out to him first now or before. Henry set the phone down, pulled on a jacket, and headed downstairs. After sleeping all day, he was hungry. As he entered the living room, the door opened, and Irene walked in with Richard, who was holding her arm tightly. Irene carried shopping bags in both hands. At the sight of Henry, Irene frowned instinctively, the smile on her face gradually fading. Henry noticed the change but remained emotionless, glancing briefly at them before heading to the kitchen. Seems like Henry doesn't welcome me, Richard said suddenly, displeased. If that's the case, I'm leaving. Irene quickly grabbed hold of Richard as he turned to leave, looking at Henry with some discontent. Didn't you ask him to accompany me? Why were you acting all cold? I didn't, Henry replied. Irene, this is your home. It's normal if he doesn't welcome me. Let me go. Richard put on a slightly hurt expression. Apologize to Richard, Irene demanded, her tone firm. I didn't do anything wrong. Why should I apologize? Henry refused. Whether you did or didn't, you upset Richard, so you need to apologize, Irene said, showing no attempt to hide her bias. Henry was taken aback, fingers curling slightly. Meeting her increasingly cold gaze, a pang shot through his heart. He'd always thought Irene was just indifferent, not one to show favoritism like that. Turns out, she'd only ever been partial to Richard all along. How did he ever think Irene loved him? Henry stayed quiet for a long time, while Irene's patience wore thin. Don't you want shares in WH Group? Henry snapped out of his thoughts, took a deep breath to suppress the bitterness, and muttered, Richard, I didn't mean to be unwelcoming. Please don't be upset. Come on in. Richard flashed a brief smirk before pouting again. I'll forgive you this time. If it happens again, I'm leaving. Richard and Irene settled down on the couch, digging into their shopping bags and occasionally glancing at Henry. I'm hungry. I want something Henry cooked, Richard said. Have the maid do it. He doesn't know how, Irene replied instinctively. No. I want it, Richard whined, tossing aside the new clothes he'd bought. Irene was notably patient with him, gently reassuring him. All right, we'll have him cook. What do you want? Seafood. Irene turned to Henry. Prepare seafood. If you can't, have the maid teach you. Henry didn't respond and headed into the kitchen. Irene and Richard chatted and laughed in the living room, seemingly planning the wedding attire and ceremony. Henry prepared 12 different seafood dishes, arranging them beautifully before asking a maid to call Irene and Richard. He sat in his usual spot, serving himself a bowl of soup. The bowl slipped from his hand. The hot soup splashed on the back of his hand, leaving it red and scalded. "Richard, are you okay?" Irene's urgent voice sounded. "I'm fine. I didn't mean to bump into Henry." Richard feigned panic, but his eyes flashed with triumph. Henry glanced at his blistered hand, then at Irene's immediate concern for Richard, and smirked wryly. The distinction between love and indifference was all too clear. Thankfully, he didn't love her anymore. Henry silently tended to his burn. When he returned to the dining room, the table was a mess with no food left for him. He had a cup of hot milk and went back to his room. Irene stayed with Richard in the villa, but late at night, she returned to the room. Henry felt the bed dip as Irene wrapped her arms around him. He instinctively wriggled away, but Irene's low voice murmured in his ear, "You've gone through so much for me to fulfill my dying wish." Henry stiffened, slowly opening his eyes, confused by her words. Was she feeling sorry for him? "Even if I marry Richard, you're still my only husband. No one can take your place. You'll still get what's yours." Irene's voice was increasingly gentle. "So, give your eternal to Richard. My estate can't go to him. After I'm gone, he needs something to live on." Henry's heart clenched sharply, tears welling in his eyes. Irene wasn't feeling sorry for him or grateful. She just wanted him to give Richard his creation. Eternal is a code he designed with significant value in new energy development. It had been validated and could be patented and licensed any time. Beyond immense wealth, it could offer Henry a high standing in his field. Irene knew how important this was to him. "Irene, I can't agree to that." Henry shook his head. He gently released her arm, sitting up. "That's my work, my creation. I'll never give it to someone else." Irene's eyes flickered. Her gaze inspected Henry, noticing a determination in his eyes that put her on edge. He seemed different somehow. "Irene, I'm begging you, please don't take away my eternal. Okay?" Henry's eyes were red, and his voice was pleading as he reached out to grab Irene's arm. "You can leave the inheritance to him. Just give me the shares of WH Group." Something Henry said must have triggered Irene. She suddenly looked angry, coldly staring at him. "Do you really not care about my money?" Henry shook his head and opened his mouth to explain, but Irene had already pulled her arm away. "I'm not negotiating with you. All your research was done with support from the booths. You have no right to refuse." Irene got up and left, slamming the door hard enough to break Henry's heart. In less than half an hour, news about Eternal hit the internet. Richard, the designer and developer, was interviewed via live stream by the media overnight. He announced that he would submit the patent papers first thing in the morning. Henry, holding his phone, rushed into Richard's room. Before he could say a word, Irene's bodyguards grabbed him. "That's the design concept of Eternal. I'm sorry for disturbing your rest so late. I'm just too excited to share my results with you. Good night." Richard waved at the camera, a bright smile on his face, as if he was genuinely presenting his own work. "Don't believe him," Henry shouted, only to be instantly silenced by the bodyguard until the interview ended. The guard finally let him go. Staggering, Henry confronted Irene, eyes bloodshot. "Irene, why? I told you I want to give Richard a leg up." Irene seemed somewhat guilty, looking away. "I can compromise on anything but not Eternal." "I'll reclaim what's mine," Henry said, wiping away his tears and standing to leave. Irene watched him walk away, an odd feeling creeping in. She didn't want him to go. "Irene, it's his design. He must have evidence. What if he exposes me tomorrow? I should have never agreed to that interview. I don't want to be criticized." Richard clung to Irene's arm, tears starting to fall. Irene refocused, frowning. She gently touched the top of Richard's head, then coldly instructed the bodyguards to take Henry to the basement. He's not to leave until I say so. Let me go. I'm not going to the basement. Don't touch me. Irene. Henry cried and struggled all the way, but Irene felt no sympathy. Locked in the dark basement, it felt like he was thrown into a pit of despair. When Henry was 5, he was kidnapped and kept crammed in a dark box for 3 days and nights. When the police found him, he was barely alive, suffering severe PTSD. He feared being alone, the dark, and sleeping. Henry's parents paused everything to support him through treatment. It took 5 whole years for him to recover. Now, in his heightened emotional state, he couldn't control his fear. The darkness around him felt like invisible hands closing in, squeezing tightly. Let me out. Irene, I'm scared. Henry pounded hard on the basement door. Please let me out. I'm begging you. I'm really scared. I'm gonna die. Henry clawed desperately at the iron door until his fingers bled, leaving bloody marks. His breaths became shallow, his head throbbed, and he started banging his head on the door until he passed out. The next morning, Irene, alongside Richard, dressed up for a launch event to introduce Eternal to the market with a high-stakes bidding process. Richard, as the developer of Eternal, was the center of attention. Holding Henry's research notebook, he confidently handled questions from both reporters and experts with Irene at his side. He went from unknown to a rising star in the new energy field overnight. The launch event quickly wrapped up, and Irene threw him a celebration party. Irene, at such a special moment, Henry should be here. Richard was eager to show off. Irene looked at him affectionately, agreeing to take him. She returned to the villa to fetch Henry, intending to let him know that everything was decided and stop him from causing trouble. The basement door opened, and the bloody scent hit her. Irene frowned deeply. In the dim light, Henry was curled in the corner, trembling with his head buried in his arms. He slowly lifted his head at the light, looking through dried blood at Irene standing in the doorway. Henry? Irene was shocked. She never imagined he'd end up like this. You? Irene, I don't want Eternal anymore. Please let me out. I'm scared. Henry got up and ran towards her. I don't want it. I truly don't. Irene shuddered slightly, speechless, but she reached out and helped him out of the basement. As Richard called, urging Irene, she glanced at the frail Henry on the bed. Torn for a moment, she finally gave in to Richard. I'll be right there. She had someone tend to Henry's wounds, dress him in clean attire, and cover the injury on his forehead with concealer. Henry didn't move throughout, but as they left, he suddenly paused. Could I get the shares of WH Group now? Henry attempted to ask. It's fine if not, just don't put me in the basement again. His body trembled slightly, shivering. Irene knitted her brows but surprisingly didn't refuse. She immediately had a lawyer prepare electronic documents. While waiting, she inadvertently glanced around the sparsely furnished living room. Did you throw stuff out? Henry nodded, acknowledging the change. A brief silence followed, with Irene biting back her words. The lawyer sent the documents. Both Irene and Henry signed, activating the agreement instantly. Henry exhaled in relief. The banquet hall was lit up, buzzing with excitement. Guests toasted and praised Richard endlessly. Richard was on cloud 9. His smile never left his face. When he saw Irene and Henry walk in, he approached them with a grin. Henry, you here to congratulate me too? Richard pretended to hug Henry, whispering menacingly, See, everything you had is now mine. You're no match for me. Henry's expression was numb. He spoke in a flat tone, Congrats, you won. Can you marry Irene now? Nope, Richard sneered, you haven't satisfied me yet. What more do you need? Henry locked eyes with him, showing a hint of hopelessness. Richard smirked, and with a bright grin, glanced around. For you to be a rat, lose everything. Henry shivered, looking at Richard in horror. Richard shoved a sharp pin into Henry's hand, forcing him to strike his own cheek. The pin sliced Richard's cheek, blood flowing out. "Henry," Richard exclaimed, "do you want me dead? Why are you pushing me so hard? I love Irene but never wanted to break you two apart. I just wanted to take care of her in her final days. If you're going to kill me, let me stay with her till the end. I'll give you eternity, give you all my money." Richard broke down, kneeling before Henry. The room fell to silence, all eyes on them. Online gossip had painted Henry as the villain splitting up Irene and Richard. The room stared daggers, wishing him ill. Henry stood there, the bloody pin dropped from his hand. Irene grabbed his wrist coldly. "Henry, who gave you the right to hurt someone?" Henry winced, meeting her gaze, his face pale and weary. He suddenly felt too tired to explain himself. His broken nails bled, and his swollen palm couldn't hold a thing. Anyone could see he couldn't have cut Richard. "Take him to the police," Irene ordered in disappointment, shoving him away and helping Richard out the door. Irene's security team seized Henry, sending him to the lockup. There he faced some menacing thugs who beat him mercilessly, forcing his head into a filthy pool, breaking his fingers one by one. Within an hour, Henry was near death. He thought maybe dying wouldn't be so bad. Group shares were back in the right hands. Dying meant he could face his father. If only he'd listened, stayed away from Irene, married into the Browns, things wouldn't have turned out like this. He thought he could last until it was over. In a daze, he imagined his white-haired mother. After his father's death, she handed the company to an assistant and went abroad alone. Henry's mother hated him for stressing his father into illness, for not seeing his father one last time. Tears blurred his vision, he was hallucinating. His mother would never forgive him. Closing his eyes, he waited for death. "Henry, I'm late." His mother's voice rang unexpectedly in his ears. Henry opened his eyes. "Mom," he spoke excitedly, trying to sit up. "Frail, I'm sorry. Don't be scared, I'm here." His mother's tears flowed. "I'll take you home. Hold on a little longer." Henry collapsed, sobbing in her arms, passing out as they reached the car. His mother brought him back to the Wiltons, fearing Irene might hurt him again. She had a professional medical team treat him at home. While Henry lay unconscious, indignant netizens and reporters surrounded the Wiltons' villa. Amidst this, Richard had gained massive sympathy, and learning Henry attacked Richard, more came to seek revenge. Henry's mother ordered security to remove them. They violently fought back, throwing rocks, breaking windows, crashing doors. Henry apologized to Richard. They stormed the Wiltons' residence. "No one touches my son," Henry's mother yelled, standing guard at his bedside. "You're useless as a parent too. Hurting a key talent, you all deserve to die." Someone shoved her. Her fall was hard. As they moved to drag Henry off the bed, she quickly blocked them again. They'd lost all sense, pushing her down again, seizing an unconscious Henry. Leading the group, Irene arrived just in time. "Stop," she called out. Her guards pushed forward, forcing the intruders out. Henry's mother helped him back to bed, checking on him carefully. Irene glanced at his pale face, frowning. Just heading to the police and ending up like this? Could it be true, like Richard said, Henry was acting all along? Faking care, never intending to fulfill her wishes. Hurting himself repeatedly to gain sympathy, tying her to him. Now with his mother confronting Ms. Booth's. If not, she'd never have been pulled from the hospital to sort out the Wiltons' mess. Her mind on Richard alone in the hospital, her concern for Henry vanished. "I gave my son to you, not for this torment, Irene." A furious Henry's mother shouted at Irene. "Don't want it? Divorce him." Henry slowly opened his eyes, weakly holding his mother's hand. "Not now, don't divorce. Henry, she's treating you like this, yet you..." Henry's mom looked at him with a somber face, her heart heavy with pain. Henry couldn't tell his mom the truth, so he just held onto her hand tightly. As long as he's alive, he'll hang in there until Irene fakes her death and he gets what's rightfully his. Irene, overhearing this, had a strange look on her face. She never imagined Henry loved her to the point of madness. Even after all the suffering, he refused to divorce her, willing to live like a widower below the waist, unable to leave her. Irene felt a rush of emotion, but quickly regained her composure. Her heart belonged to Richard, and she'd soon be leaving with him. When intruders were driven out of the Wiltons' villa, Irene stood over Henry, looking down on him with a warning in her voice. "I'll handle the online rumors. This won't happen again. But you were wrong to hurt someone. Richard won't press charges. You know what to do when you face the old lady, right?" Henry's eyes were calm as he nodded slightly. "I'll apologize to Grandma." Satisfied, Irene walked away. Henry's mom was furious, glaring at him, wanting to say something but holding back and finally letting out a deep sigh. Her son was truly love-struck, and she couldn't understand what Irene possessed that made him care so little for his own life. "Mom, I don't love Irene anymore. I have my reasons for not divorcing her," Henry said weakly, gripping his mom's hand as he shared Irene's plans to fake illness and remarry. His mom's expression shifted from anger to shock, finally settling on deep sympathy. With things as they were, Henry's mom could only support him in persisting until Irene's staged death. Under pressure from Ms. Booth, Irene intervened to change public perception online, erasing posts about Henry and effortlessly clearing his name. After 2 days of rest, Henry was summoned back to the Booth family's old residence. "I hear you're helping Irene plan a wedding?" Ms. Booth sat at the head of the table, her sharp gaze carrying authority without anger. Henry lowered his eyes and nodded. "Yes." "Ridiculous." Ms. Booth slammed her hand on the chair's back, scolding him. Henry shrank back, explaining quietly, "Irene is dying, and this is her final wish." Upon hearing this, Ms. Booth was stunned, looking at Henry incredulously. "What did you say?" Henry produced the critical condition notice and diagnosis. "I just want Irene to pass without regrets." Ms. Booth's expression froze. She valued equal matches and disdained someone of Richard's lowly origins and cunning nature. There was no way she'd let him become part of the Booths, yet now she hesitated. "Grandma, please let Irene have her way." Ms. Booth said nothing, waving Henry off to leave. Back in his and Irene's room, just after lying down, the door was kicked open by an irate Irene storming in. "Henry, I can't believe I trusted you. You got the shares and now you're playing games?" Irene grabbed Henry's wrist, pulling him off the bed. He fell to the ground unprepared. "Where's Richard? Why'd you let Grandma take him?" Irene's eyes were wild, her fury like fire ready to ignite him. "I don't know. Irene, have some sense. Do I have any power to interfere with Grandma's decisions?" Irene's face was cold, immune to his words. "You have 1 day to return Richard to me, or you'll be planning your mom's funeral." Henry's heart sank as he focused on Irene with tears filling his eyes. "What have you done to my mom? You can't hurt her." Unmoved, Irene showed him a video on her phone, where Henry's mom dangled precariously from a crane, swinging in the wind. "Let my mom go. I'll help you find Richard," Henry cried, crawling before Irene. Her expression wavered briefly, but her voice stayed cold. "Find Richard, and I'll release her. Please bring her down first. She has heart issues. She can't handle this." Henry pleaded. "Don't waste time begging me. Find Richard. You have 1 hour," Irene stated coldly, leaving with her phone. Henry struggled to his feet, kneeling outside the old lady's room. "Please, Grandma, let them be. It's just a wedding done quietly. It won't disgrace the Booths. Grandma, let Irene see Richard." Henry kept pleading and bowing for 40 straight minutes until Ms. Booth finally opened her door. Seeing Henry, she inhaled deeply, her resolve weakening. "Fine, I'm old. I won't meddle in young people's affairs. He's at the Hilltop Estate, go find him." "Thank you, Grandma. Thank you." Henry expressed his gratitude repeatedly, rising to find Irene. He fell as soon as he started walking. Ignoring the pain, he climbed to his feet, taking only a few steps before tumbling down the stairs, but he gritted his teeth and kept moving. Irene Richards at the Hilltop estate. Where's my mom? In the garage, Henry found Irene. She started the car at his words. Henry jumped in front of the car, nearly hit by her. She glared at him. Are you insane? Where's my mom? Henry demanded, arms wide as he stood defiantly in front of the car. Irene's eyes flickered with surprise, as if she was seeing a new side to Henry, but with Richard on her mind, she couldn't ponder it. At the harbor, Henry raced to another car, speeding off ahead of Irene from the old residence. When he reached the harbor, he saw his mom still hanging in the air. Tears streamed uncontrollably as he cautiously climbed onto the platform to operate the machinery, gently lowering her to the ground. Henry's mom had a heart attack and fell into a coma. No matter how much Henry called out, she didn't respond. Mom, wake up, please. Don't scare me. Open your eyes. Mom, Mom. Don't leave me, Mom. Tears blurred his vision as Henry rushed his mom to the hospital. The doctor said it was too late. Henry leaned against the wall outside the ER, grabbing his collar. He opened his mouth to cry but found he couldn't. His heart was completely shattered. He realized then that when you're in the deepest pain, you can't even cry. Henry had his mom's body put in cold storage temporarily and dragged his soulless self back to the villa. Irene had already found Richard and began secretly planning a fake death scheme. Ms. Booths had kidnapped Richard, so they couldn't delay any longer. She knew Ms. Booths well enough to know that even though she'd agreed to return Richard, she could change her mind any moment. She wanted to take Richard and escape far away. When she saw Henry, both Irene and Richard were startled. It's broad daylight. Why are you acting like a ghost? Richard complained. Henry acted like he couldn't hear, walking mechanically up the stairs. Passing Irene, he paused, glanced at her, and a hint of hatred spread across his eyes. Irene, do people turn into ghosts when they die? Henry suddenly asked. Irene froze, looking at him confused, seeing his lost and pained expression. She thought he couldn't let her go and tried to comfort him. When people die, it's like turning off a light. Try not to dwell on it. So that's how it is. He continued walking, but Irene felt uneasy. Henry, don't do anything rash because of me. Live well. Henry forced a wry smile. Do something rash for you? She's overthinking. Irene and Richard's wedding was being planned. During this time, Irene constantly pretended to be gravely ill, even coughing up blood now and then. Ms. Booths was desperate, constantly seeking specialists to try and extend her life. The wedding took place. The officiant brought the bride and groom up, read the vows, exchanged rings, and completed the ceremony. Henry stood quietly in the corner, as if everything was unrelated to him. He was just waiting for the moment Irene died. As soon as the two left the venue, Irene suddenly collapsed, blood pouring from her mouth and nose, and was rushed to the hospital. Henry, I'm so sorry. I left you widowed so young. If there's a next life, don't marry me again. Before being wheeled into the ER, Irene looked steadily at Henry. Please live well. I've left a trust fund for you. If you want to have a child through a surrogate one day, you can use my egg. So you'll have a part of me with you. Once I'm gone, Richard will leave too, so don't make things hard for him. Irene's words were sincere, tears dripping down as if she truly regretted dying. Richard clung to her hand, sobbing uncontrollably. Before she was even in the ER, he fainted. Go in peace. I'll live on. Henry avoided her extended hand and spoke coolly. Irene's heart sank sharply. She looked at him uneasily, wanting to say something, but she was already being wheeled inside. 2 hours later, attempts to resuscitate her failed. Irene was dead. Ms. Booths was so overwhelmed she fainted. The Booths family rushed her to another ER. Only Henry stood quietly by, and once they left, he turned to the office to issue a death certificate. He cremated Irene's body and handled the paperwork to settle her estate. Swiftly, he signed inheritance agreements with the lawyer and took everything owed to him. After Ms. Booths had her stroke, Henry handled Irene's funeral arrangements. Irene's funeral was massive. Nearly everyone from the neighborhood knew she had died, and mourners packed the Booths' estate. Midway through the ceremony, Henry quietly slipped out. He went back to his room, changed into the suit the Browns had sent earlier, and holding a bouquet of bright red flowers, walked through the hallway and out of the Booths' estate. Henry's actions caused a stir. Irene hadn't even been buried yet, and he was already in a hurry to play the groom. Some called him shameless. Others said he was insane from shock. No matter how loud or harsh the comments, Henry never looked back. As he got into the wedding car, he spoke softly. "Irene, your part is finished. From now on, we have no ties. What you owe me has been repaid." Meanwhile, Irene changed clothes and met up with Richard. Hand in hand, they left the hospital. Following their plan, they got on a private plane, with their first stop being Northern Europe. Irene were finally free. They say couples who see the northern lights stay together forever. Richard leaned against Irene's chest, a smile he couldn't hide on his face. Irene hesitated for a moment. This didn't seem as joyous as she imagined. Her eyebrows furrowed slightly, and Henry's calm face flashed in her mind. When he saw her die, he didn't seem sad at all. Henry, who clearly loved her dearly. Her frown deepened. Was he just pretending to be calm because he was worried about her? Planning to end it all after? "Irene, what are you thinking?" Richard asked, puzzled by her silence. Irene snapped out of it, "Oh, nothing. Just a bit tired." "Well, as long as you're okay. You promised me Michelin-starred food after we land. You can't get out of it by claiming you're too tired." Richard playfully coaxed her. Irene nodded, but her thoughts drifted back to Henry again. Whenever she said she was tired, he would gently massage her temples to help. He'd make her a cup of herbal tea, too. His gaze was always gentle and full of care, always considerate of her, never demanding anything. Irene frowned slightly. She was acting weird today, constantly comparing Henry to Richard in her mind. There was no real comparison. She'd always loved Richard. She forced herself to stop thinking about Henry. She should be happy. Finally, she could break free from the Booths and be carefree with Richard. When the plane landed, Henry was out of her mind. She took Richard to a Michelin restaurant. They lugged their big bags to the swankiest hotel suite around. As soon as they were inside, Richard was all over her, wrapping his arms around her waist and kissing her cheeks and lips. He seductively unbuttoned her blouse. Irene's eyes darkened. Richard's touch ignited her passion. They fell onto the bed together. She loved how forward Richard was, something Henry never did. They stayed in the hotel for 3 full days, exploring everything they could. Irene felt her body had been discovered to its fullest. "Irene, will you marry me?" Richard asked with hopeful eyes after one of their sessions. Her heart skipped a beat, and she felt an odd resistance, saying instinctively, "This is nice. Marriage is such a hassle. But don't you want to have kids with me?" Richard frowned. He hadn't imagined aimlessly wandering the world with Irene forever. "Let's talk about it later," she replied, sounding a bit annoyed, wanting to drop the topic. Richard looked discontent, flipping over to get on top of her again. "If you don't want to get married, we won't. I'm willing to be with you without a title forever." He kissed her again, pulling her back into the depths of desire. Irene and Richard spent a week in Northern Europe, cutting off all ties with their past. They had no clue that the Booths were going through major turmoil. Ms. Booths had a stroke, and things were chaotic at her funeral, turning the family into a city-wide joke. Irene's mom fainted from anger at the scene, and her dad had to pull through alone, managing the funeral. That day, the Booths' stock plummeted. Irene's father was frantic, close to a breakdown multiple times. At the same time, Henry wept bitterly at his mom's memorial. "Mom, I won't let you die in vain. I'll make Irene pay for what she did," he vowed. After leaving the Booths, he was driven to Linda's villa. She arranged for him to stay at the Browns' place and helped him with his mom's funeral arrangements. Henry didn't stay down for long. He returned to WH Group, determined to take control again and make Irene pay. Half a month flew by, and Irene and Richard were done with Northern Europe. They were prepping for a flight to Australia. But before boarding, the crew stopped them. "Sorry, the plane's ownership has changed. Without the owner's consent, you can't board," they told her. "What are you talking about?" Irene's brows furrowed, her face growing cold. "How is it I've never heard my plane was someone else's?" "Seriously?" Richard, full of arrogance, tried to intimidate the captain. "Get out of the way, we're in a hurry." The captain maintained a polite smile but didn't let them pass. Irene's frown deepened. Richard's attitude irked her. He used to be so cautious and pitiful, making her want to protect him. Yet lately, he had this audacity about him, demanding things and spending money like water. Whenever he didn't get what he wanted, he'd sulk and whine, accusing her of falling out of love. Compared to him, she thought Henry's quiet, selfless nature, always putting her first, was better. In the quiet of night, she even considered going back to him. "What are you staring at? Move!" Richard yelled. "Irene, fire all these blockers." "Enough, stop it." Irene pushed Richard away. "What do you think you look like making this scene?" Richard stumbled back, eyes welling up. Before he could whine again, Irene went up to the captain. "What's going on?" The captain handed her a copy of an inheritance agreement. It clearly stated this plane had been inherited by Henry, and all her other assets were distributed among inheritors. Irene snatched the agreement, studied it closely, her face changing in disbelief. How is that possible? Not only was the private jet no longer hers, but all her bank accounts had been deactivated, making her funds inaccessible. "Don't you watch the news? You're broke." The captain smirked and walked off with the crew. Richard, already feeling dejected, heard the captain's disdain and broke down right there. Clinging to Irene's arm, he shook her. "Irene, what does this mean? Tell me you're not penniless." Irene shook him off impatiently, watching him fall awkwardly, not feeling any sympathy. She blurted out, "When will you be dignified like Henry? You panic at every little thing. It's embarrassing. You're comparing me to that jerk Henry? How is he better than me?" "Irene, who do you think you are to yell at me?" Richard shouted, frustrated. "I followed you to God knows where, gave up everything, and this is how you treat me?" Irene's patience wore thin. Aside from what he could do in bed, he was nothing compared to Henry. She regretted everything. With a heavy chest, she turned and walked away, annoyed. "Irene, wait up!" Richard shouted as he saw her turn away. He quickly got up to chase after her. Richard had never seen Irene this mad before. Afraid to add fuel to the fire, he followed her with some struggle. Irene tried every card she had, but none of them worked. Without any ID, she couldn't buy a plane ticket or even get into her usual hotels. After all the hassle, she was exhausted and hungry, so she called a friend to borrow some money. "Hey, Coco, can you send me $5 million? I'll pay you back once I'm back," she asked casually. Coco didn't answer right away, so Irene repeated herself. "Coco, can you send me some money?" she urged. "The most I can give you is 10,000, Coco said quietly after a long pause. "What do you mean? I used to give you projects worth more than that," Irene shouted, only to be cut off. "Things have changed. Not even the booths can pay back 5 million now. Consider this 10 grand as the end of our relationship. Don't contact me again," Coco said before hanging up. She sent the money to Irene's account. Irene was furious, almost throwing her phone in anger. She reached out to about 5 or 6 other friends, all unwilling to lend her money. Some even hung up as soon as they heard her voice. "Irene, what happened? Why are they giving you so little? That's not fair." Richard's face was pale with worry. "Are you really broke?" "I'm starving. Let's get something to eat first." Irene didn't respond. She instinctively led him into a posh restaurant, where they quickly spent the borrowed money on just one meal. With Richard's money insufficient for a luxury hotel, they ended up in a cramped, windowless motel that felt suffocating. "Irene, you gotta think of something. We'll starve without any cash," Richard lamented, pacing in front of her. "Maybe we should go back home." Say you faked your death. I'll still be with you. Irene, lost in thought about what Coco and others had said, wondered aloud, how could the Booths not pay back a measly $5 million? Did something happen to them? Richard, seeing she was ignoring him, shook her arm. Are you even listening to me? Come on, do something. Irene wrenched free from his grip. Shut up. If it wasn't for you convincing me to fake my death, we wouldn't be in this mess, she snapped. You're blaming me? Richard was in disbelief, tears welling up. In the past, such a look would have softened Irene's heart. Today, she felt only regret and annoyance. For this man, she tossed away the Booth's fortune and gave up on Henry, who was a wonderful husband. Sell your luxury stuff and then let's head back home, she said, uninterested in fighting. She got up to pack his designer goods. Richard jumped up, blocking her path. Irene's eyes darkened. She slapped him hard. Yours? Which of these did you not get with my money? Ignoring his protests, Irene grabbed the items and headed to the door. But Richard, in a fit of rage, hurled an ashtray at her, knocking her down. Blood trailed down from the back of her head as disbelief filled her eyes. You made me do this. You left me no choice. Richard screamed, dropping the ashtray as he ran off with his luggage. Don't leave me. Take me to a hospital, Richard. Irene reached out towards him. I don't want to die. Her hand fell slowly, overwhelmed by regret and helplessness. Back home, Henry inherited shares from his mother and took back WH Group shares from Irene, becoming the largest shareholder. At the board meeting, he sat in the chairman's seat, surrounded by hostile stakeholders. Henry, why disrupt your comfortable life for the company? They sneered. Irene's barely cold, and you're with the Browns already. Are they stingy too? Aren't Linda's charms better than corporate headaches? Everyone mocked his reputation, claiming he'd damaged the company. Even your mom never meddled. Why bother when you're not even a proper part of the family? Take your dividends and just leave. You'll only screw things up more. Since Henry's father passed, his mother neglected the company, living off dividends, making board members feel entitled. No way. As the largest shareholder, I have a say in being chairman. Oh, please. Lewis waved dismissively. You'll learn the hard way. He signaled and security men walked in. Escort him to relax, eat, and sleep, Lewis ordered. Take some nice photos. If he doesn't play nice, give him a happy pill. Lewis glared maliciously at Henry as bodyguards manhandled him. Let me go, you can't do this. You think you can overthrow us, kid? Lewis sneered. But just then, Linda elegantly walked in, standing firmly by Henry's side. Who said Henry can't handle things? Her icy stare shot through Lewis. You refuse, you deal with me. Seeing Linda's authority, Lewis felt a chill run down his spine. Linda, why stand up for this trash against us? We're powerful families. Linda merely smirked, decide. Take on the Browns together or one by one. I'm waiting. She ensured Henry was unhurt, then sighed in relief. From now on, Henry is WH Group's chairman. Mess with him, you mess with me, Linda declared, presenting a file. She watched each shareholder sign it, sealing Henry's position. Henry looked at the woman in front of him, feeling something he couldn't quite put into words. Linda grabbed Henry's hand and got into the car. He looked at her several times, wanting to say something but held back. Got something on your mind? Linda asked with a smile. Henry nodded, his eyes serious. Do you really want to marry me? For sure. The day you wear a suit and stand before me, you're my husband. When you've got time, let's get the license and have a wedding. Linda joked, half serious. Okay. Henry wanted to ask why but decided to swallow his question. Marriage was his father's last wish and also his best option right now. As Henry was lost in thought, Linda leaned in and whispered in his ear, From now on, I'll be your support. Everything from the Browns is at your disposal. Do whatever you want. A shiver ran up Henry's spine. He couldn't help but tremble a little. Just then, the car screeched to a stop. Someone was blocking their way. Henry gasped, losing his balance and falling towards Linda. His face turned red in a second. In his confusion, someone outside started banging on the window. Henry quickly sat back, rolled down the window, and looked out. There was a woman in ragged clothes, dirty and sunburnt beyond recognition. "It's Irene, your wife," she said, her voice hoarse and desperate. "I'm not dead. I'm still alive." Henry's face remained blank as he studied her closely. "Henry, I've missed you. Please get out and take me home," Irene pleaded, her hands pressed against the glass, eyes bloodshot as she declared who she was again. After a long silence, Henry spoke slowly, his voice distant. "Sorry, I don't know you. My ex-wife is dead." "Henry, how can you not recognize me? You loved me so much. You even made friends with your rival for my sake." Irene met Henry's increasingly cold gaze, her words catching in her throat. Henry averted his eyes and instructed the driver to roll up the window and drive on. Irene clung to the glass until her fingers were caught. She winced in pain, pleading, "Henry, it hurts. Won't you look at me?" Henry remained indifferent. Burdened by the pain, Irene finally let go. Watching the car drive away, she chased after it, shouting Henry's name. "Henry, I barely survived to come back. You can't ignore me like this." It turned out that after Richard injured her, a hotel cleaner had saved her. She pawned her jewelry and bags to cover her medical bills and used the rest to sneak back into the country. The moment Irene returned, she sought out Henry, imagining him mourning her. Henry would surely cry tears of joy on seeing her. She planned to apologize genuinely, hoping for his forgiveness so they could live a happy life together. From then on, she'd be faithful to him alone. But as soon as she returned, she heard about Henry and Linda. She refused to believe it. Henry was supposed to love her more than anything. How could he marry someone else while she was still presumed dead? "Henry, you can't do this to me. I'm the love of your life." Irene was unwilling to give up and chased Henry's car all the way to the Browns' villa. Ignoring the guards' attempts to stop her, she pushed forward only to be repeatedly thrown to the ground, picking herself back up each time. "Let me in, I need to find my husband." "Linda, who do you think you are to marry my husband?" "Henry, honey, come out." Thrown out again, the gate finally opened as Henry stepped out. He was 2 meters away, looking at her coldly. "You finally came out to see me, Henry. Come home with me, please." Irene, dirty and bloodied, lay on the ground, a mess. Looking down at her, Henry smirked slightly. "Home? You have no home. What do you mean?" Irene's heart skipped a beat. She was thinking only of Henry, not having visited the Booths' place yet. "Let's go back to the Booths' old house or the villa." Spotting the panic in her eyes, Henry aimed for the heart. "I sold the villa. As for the Booths' old house, the bank will soon take it. Playing dead wasn't enough? Now you're back from the dead? Did you really think everyone is a fool, Irene?" Irene shook her head. "Henry, you know everything? I was wrong. I admit it. After leaving with Richard, I realized I loved you, only you. I lost my mind, did something so stupid. But I'm back now, ready to settle down with you. We can have kids, travel together." Irene's voice grew frantic, her emotions stirred up, causing her to cough up blood. Henry stepped back 2 steps, a hint of disgust crossing his eyes. Seeing his gaze, Irene felt her heart, as if cut by a dull blade, ache painfully. Henry had changed. He didn't love her anymore. He'd once been so attentive. Once when she had a slight fever, he stayed up all night taking care of her. He used to love her so much. How did it change? "Henry, please don't do this to me. I truly know I was wrong." Henry maintained his cold demeanor. "I don't know you. Stop bothering me. My fiancé wouldn't like it. At least, give me back my property." Irene struggled to stand, moving towards Henry. Henry stepped back inside the door. "To kill you heart and soul. Those were left to me by my ex-wife as inheritance. Nothing to do with you." Seeing her face change, she stepped forward, grasping the gate bars. a sudden rush of anger causing her vision to blur before she fainted. As heavy rain fell, each cold drop hit her body, slowly bringing her back to consciousness. She was still lying outside the Browns' gate, completely ignored. She picked herself up, dragging her beaten body back to the booths. Irene thought once she reclaimed her identity, Henry would come around. She practically crawled to the booth's old house and fainted before she could even knock. When she woke up, she saw her father, tears streaming down his face. He no longer looked dignified, his face pale and sickly. Nearby stood Irene's mother, visibly thinner and exhausted. "You fool. Pretending to be dead over a man. Look at what you've done to the booths," her father yelled, slapping Irene hard across the face. "Why didn't you just die out there? You come back to what? The booths is gone, everything's gone." Her father sobbed and hit her again. Irene found out from their scolding that after she left, her grandmother's health worsened, and she passed away. BJ Group stock had plummeted, and many partners ended their deals, causing major projects to fail and massive fines to pile up. The Browns were the ones pulling the strings behind all of these crises. "The man you look down on, the Browns treasure him. This was all aimed at us. You're such a fool." Irene was shocked. She couldn't believe Henry would do such a thing. He had always been so easy for her to handle. "Don't worry, Henry's just angry with me. Once I make him happy again, everything will be back to normal," Irene said confidently. Seeing this, her father stopped hitting her and stormed off. Irene focused on healing and taking back control of the booth's business. She had been the most talented in the family, having brought the booths to prominence before. She wasn't fazed by the current challenges. Once she was back into the swing of things, she went after Henry. Every day, she sent him a bouquet of roses. She even hired people to play a video of her confessing her love outside his villa. In the videos, Irene was all dolled up, smiling into the camera. "Henry, I didn't see my own heart clearly before. It's always been you I love. Give me another chance and we'll be so happy." Henry, fed up, had his security team chase them away. But soon, new faces would arrive with the same message. When the guards were kicking them out again, Irene herself showed up. She pulled up in the booth's last Rolls-Royce, holding a big bouquet of roses. "Henry, I'm here to take you home. Tonight, let's go stargazing on the mountain. Tomorrow, we'll cruise on the ocean. The day after, we'll watch the northern lights. Everything I couldn't do with you before, I'll make it up to you now. I've already applied to get my identity back. Once my death certificate is voided, our marriage will still stand. You'll be my husband forever," Irene said gently, her words laced with a hint of threat. Henry frowned, unsure if Irene was bluffing. Linda, who had walked up without any of them noticing, slipped her arm around Henry, leading him away. "That's if you can get your identity restored," she scoffed. "You think the booths can rise again? Linda, this is between me and my husband. Stay out of it," Irene snapped back. "You're just a lowlife who took down the booths while I was gone. Now I'm back. I'll take back the company and Henry. Don't worry, Henry. With me here, you're going home with us," Irene said resolutely. Henry chuckled, patting Linda reassuringly before walking up to Irene. He took the flowers from her hands. Irene's eyes shone with delight. She just knew Henry still loved her. Henry tossed the flowers back in her face, the thorns scraping her cheek, leaving her momentarily stunned. "I stopped loving you a long time ago," he said coldly. "Every time you hurt me for Richard, my boyhood affection for you drained away. Being with Linda was my choice, the best one I ever made. You caused my mother's death. You should pay for that. As for our so-called marriage, let's see you try to get your identity back." His eyes were cold and full of hatred, his words piercing Irene's heart painfully. Irene had never seen Henry so fierce. She instinctively stepped back. "No, I didn't kill her. I was just scaring you," she insisted. Henry slapped her hard. "Don't trouble me again. There's only hatred left between us. We're enemies for life." Irene looked at him in disbelief, unable to accept how much Henry despised her. "No, you still love me. No matter when I turned back, you were always there for me. You're just mad at me, right? Tell me how to earn your forgiveness. Even if you died, I wouldn't forgive you, Henry said, pulling Linda with him as he left. Irene stood frozen, watching his back, whispering to herself, I don't believe it. You're lying. Are you okay? Linda was standing behind Henry, full of concern and heartache. His mother's death was a wound in his heart. Henry forced a smile, turning to her. I'm fine. Then a cold glint appeared in his eyes. Will you help me? I want the booths to collapse. Of course. Whatever you decide to do, I'm with you. Go all out. If it gets tough, I'll step in. Linda lovingly brushed the top of his head and wiped his tears with her thumb. Henry nodded, pulling her into a hug. Spending time together had awakened new, complex feelings in Henry about Linda. With her, he was at ease, able to be his true self without fear. With Linda's help, Henry secured his position as president of WH Group and led the company to strategically acquire the booth's projects at a bargain. He even actively suppressed the booth's progress by dumping the inherited shares he had, causing BJ Group stock to fluctuate. Irene was worn out, and every attempt to meet Henry during this time was refused. The little gifts she sent were all returned by Henry. Irene was overwhelmed, and the company's financial situation was getting worse, not looking good for much longer. One day, Irene personally went down to WH Group and waited to see Henry. He was dressed in a white suit, and there was a mature aura about him that she had never seen before. Her eyes were full of surprise, staring at him, unable to move. Henry, can we talk? She asked, losing her usual arrogance. Without even a glance at her, Henry turned her down. My aim is to ruin you. There's nothing to talk about. What about Mom's death? Irene stepped forward to block him. Henry paused and looked at her. What did you say? The truth about Mom's death is different, Irene said, taking a deep breath full of sorrow. Henry, half believing, hesitated for a few seconds and still agreed to go with her. Irene took Henry to the restaurant he always wanted to visit. During the ride, she kept trying to start a conversation, but Henry ignored her. She wasn't bothered and kept reminiscing on her own. Henry, do you remember when I saved you that time? And when you gave me chocolates and said you liked me, you looked so cute. That time on my birthday when you kissed me, I was really happy. Henry acted like he didn't hear, quietly watching the scenery pass by outside. Everything was in the past. He couldn't understand the point of Irene saying these things now. Was she hoping he'd go easy on the booths? Henry, we're here. Irene's voice broke his train of thought, and he opened the door to get out of the car. Irene had booked the whole restaurant and personally brought a cart of flowers, poured him wine, and even sang love songs to him. These were all things Henry had wished for and mentioned to Irene before, though she never cared. It wasn't that she didn't hear or remember, she just felt at the time he wasn't worthy. Irene, just say it. Stop wasting time. I won't be with you and I won't stop going after you. Henry felt bored and tossed the flowers aside. Irene's expression changed as a wave of sadness filled her heart. She wanted to plead for the booth's survival but also genuinely loved him, hoping he'd turn back. Henry, I really fell in love with you. I don't love you. Henry's harsh words stopped Irene cold, and she fell silent. After a long pause, she spoke again. It was Richard who had someone give Mom a muscle relaxant, causing her heart attack, not because she was scared into it. Henry stood frozen. What did you say? Richard killed my mom? Yes, and here's the proof. Irene handed him the results of her investigation. You misunderstood. Mom didn't die because of me. Henry read it word for word, his fingers tightening, and his face darkened. I didn't misunderstand. If you hadn't kidnapped my mom, how would he have had a chance? Irene, you're just as despicable as he is. Henry crumpled the paperwork into a ball and threw it at Irene's face. I won't forgive you guys. Without another word, he stormed out. Irene hurried to catch up and grabbed his arm, only to be slapped hard. Get lost. Henry, I'll help you get revenge. You forgive me and we can be together. You want BJ Group, I can give it to you, anything you want. Irene madly tried to hold on to him. He kicked her hard, making her clutch her belly in pain and crouch down. If I want BJ Group, I'll take it myself. Seeing you makes me sick. Henry walked away without looking back. He ran to his mother's grave and cried for a long time until Linda came to take him away when it got dark. Meanwhile, Richard returned to the country. Hearing that Irene was back with the Booths, he rushed over to find her. Playing the victim, he crouched outside the Booths' gate. When he saw a car approaching, he carefully stood up. Irene, I'm here to apologize. I was wrong then, I didn't mean to hurt you. Richard kneeled in front of Irene, crying desperately, emptied of money. After I exchanged the money, I came back to find you, but you were gone. Can you forgive me? Irene's face darkened, a cold smile playing on her lips. She reached out to pull Richard up. Richard, you're quite the pretender. Almost fooled me again. From start to finish, you only loved my money, right? When I had none, you ran. Seeing I have money again, you're back. Irene dramatically tightened her grip around his neck. Richard's body trembled, and he struggled fearfully. The strong feeling of suffocation left him speechless, scrambling to scratch her arms. Scared? Weren't you afraid when you hurt Henry? Or when you caused Henry's mom's death? Or when you used me to satisfy your own greed? Irene poured all her rage onto him. It's all you. You turned Henry and me into this. She blamed Richard for everything. Just when he seemed about to suffocate, Irene suddenly let go. He fell to the ground without warning, clutching his neck and gasping violently. Have you gone mad? He asked her, red-eyed. Were you going to kill me? You deserve it, but you can't die too easily. Richard, time for you to bring Henry back to me. Irene commanded Richard to coax Henry back to her side, or she'd make him live miserably. Richard kneeled outside Henry's home with sticks tied to his back. The wooden thorns pierced his skin, staining his white shirt red with blood. His cheeks were swollen, eyes bruised, hands raised high above his head, knocking repeatedly on the ground, shivering and pleading, Henry, forgive me. I'm a wretch. I shouldn't have seduced a married woman. More and more people gathered around, and someone even started live streaming. Irene got out of the car, walked over to Richard, and kicked him. Is this it? Show some sincerity. Richard was so scared he shrank back, nodding even faster and cursing himself even harder. Henry, please forgive Irene. It wasn't her fault. I'm just that low. Everything's my fault. I shouldn't have insulted you. I shouldn't have ruined your marriage. I deserve to die. By the end, Richard's throat was hoarse, but there was no reaction from Henry inside the house. He just had the bodyguards get them out, and if they couldn't, he'd call the cops. Before the police arrived, Irene took Richard away. She thought the punishment wasn't enough, so Henry wouldn't forgive her. Irene, I've done as you asked. Can you please let me go? I've really learned my lesson, Richard pleaded. I told you you have to make Henry forgive me. It must be that your sincerity isn't enough. Think of more ways to punish yourself, Irene said, a twisted light in her eyes. Richard was startled by her expression. You're crazy, Irene. You're a madwoman. Let me go, let me go. Shut up. Irene slapped him hard, his lips instantly bleeding. Irene, you'll meet a bad end. Henry won't forgive you. He hates you, Richard screamed in pain. A woman like you doesn't deserve love. It's right for Henry to marry someone else. I said shut up. Irene grabbed him by the neck violently. Don't speak. Henry won't marry someone else. Richard struggled to breathe, trying to fight back, but he couldn't get away. His breath faded, and eventually he went limp. Irene didn't let go, applying more pressure. Shut up. Just shut up. It's all your fault, you wretch, for splitting me and Henry. It was a while before Irene released him. Richard's body slumped lifelessly to the ground. She was momentarily stunned, then checked on him. Seeing he was dead, she surprisingly didn't panic. She put his body in the trunk and took it to the Booth's basement. Over the next few days, she acted like nothing happened, sending gifts to Henry and handling company affairs. More partners wanted to cancel their contracts, so Irene had to negotiate herself, even giving away half the profits. Irene believed things would get better if she could just make it through this period. Meanwhile, Henry had had enough and didn't want to give Irene any more chances. He released evidence of BJ Group's past illicit profits and the infidelity of Irene's parents. He also exposed Irene's fake death to live freely with Richard and her sneaking back into the country. These bombshells caused BJ Group stock to plummet. Henry took the chance to buy stocks, quickly getting more shares than Irene. When Henry went to BJ Group, Irene was a wreck in her office. Why? Why do you have to destroy me utterly? Irene accused Henry fiercely. Henry watched Irene's meltdown with a faint smile. I said you'd pay for your actions. Henry, I've admitted my mistakes. How could you not forgive me? Wouldn't it be nice if we went back to the way things were? Or is it that you love the rich Linda now? Irene insinuated, as if she just realized it. Henry just smiled without a word. To him, Irene wasn't even worth talking to anymore. Clean up the office. Throw out the trash, Henry ordered coldly, seeing Irene as nothing but garbage. Irene struggled to reach Henry, but before she could touch him, the bodyguards pinned her to the ground. Henry, I really love you. I don't want anything, just to be by your side. Okay? Just to see you. With a wave of Henry's hand, the bodyguards dragged her away, bringing peace to his ears. Henry didn't actually want BJ Group. He organized the shares and company matters and gave them to Linda. I just want WH Group. All this is yours. Linda reached out to him, and naturally he took her hand, pulled her close. Henry, your confident and bright demeanor is just like when I first met you as a child. I don't remember meeting you, Henry frowned. Linda smiled, we met a few times. I wasn't impressive enough to catch your eye back then. Henry felt a pang in his heart. In his youth, all he saw was Irene, who had saved him, ignoring all the beautiful sceneries. I'm sorry, he admitted, feeling guilty. Linda lifted his chin and gently kissed him. You don't need to apologize. I'll just wait for you to willingly love me. Henry blushed, returning her kiss. Anytime. Can't wait. Linda held his head, deepening the kiss till Henry's face was red, nearly breathless, before releasing him. Their wedding was planned for a week later. On their wedding day, Linda solemnly knelt before Henry's parents' memorials and brought out a prenuptial agreement, giving all her assets to Henry. Honey, from now on, if I ever have a flicker of doubt, just kick me out empty-handed. Henry held her tightly. This, he thought, must be what true love feels like. Post-marriage, he was still very happy and grateful to have found Linda. As for Irene, word had it that before police could catch her, she stole the booth's last bit of money, hopped on a ship to Southeast Asia, and perished in a storm. Good riddance. May they never meet again in any lifetime.